Many aviators earned fame through combat in World War I. One man who was very influential in aviation in that war, and who made a giant contribution to aviation tactics later, was not a famous fighter pilot at all, but a student of air power and its use. His name was Billy Mitchell. Mitchell was the son of the United States Senator, grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. One of his boyhood friends was Douglas MacArthur, who in World War II and the Korean War won worldwide fame for outstanding service in the United States Army. By applying his considerable intelligence and abilities, Mitchell started breaking records at the early age. He was the youngest student ever to enter George Washington University when he enrolled in 1895. He became a second lieutenant in the Wisconsin Volunteers at the age of 18 and was promoted to first lieutenant a year later. By the age of 23, he became the youngest captain in the Army. In 1909, he completed the Army Staff College and was a distinguished graduate. When he was 32 years old, he was ordered to Washington to serve on the War Department's General Staff. Once again, he was the youngest Army officer given the assignment. Mitchell's interest in aviation was started at the beginning of World War I. He spent much of his time on the General Staff in Washington urging for separate and independent air service. On his own time, he studied flying at the Curtiss Company School at Newport News, Virginia. Became a pilot at the age of 36. As war progressed, Mitchell steadily climbed in rank and responsibility, becoming chief of the air service for American forces in Europe. He did his best to get first-rate aircraft and mechanics for American pilots. As a trained pilot himself, he tested British and French airplanes before he would accept them for flyers. He rejected the Sopwith Camel because of its rotary engine, gave the plane a tendency to whip into a right-hand spin, and his pilots were not sufficiently experienced to control it. Mitchell studied air power enthusiastically and met leading theorists personally. From his friend Hugh Trenchard, commander of the British Royal Flying Corps, Mitchell learned to think of the aircraft as an offensive weapon, best used in giant fleets of bombers striking against the enemy homeland. Mitchell held the title of Chief of Air Service, but control of the air wing was still totally in the hands of the Army. Mitchell saw aviation as a military effort to help ground forces. He did not think he could best be achieved by being subservient to them. Most ground officers, however, thought of the air service as an auxiliary to the land troops. Aircraft were thought to be useful for keeping an eye on enemy infantry movements and for keeping enemy aircraft away from friendly troops. Army officers of the time, of course, had been trained for ground warfare, so it was often difficult to make a case for a strong independent air service. Billy Mitchell slowly gained favor with certain folks, but his outspokenness made him the enemies too. He thought the air service should be separate from the Army so he could command the sky. Once his aircrafts had command of the sky, they could be used offensively against enemy troops. His influence was great on American flying squadrons, some of whose members were to rise to later prominence. Those men carried Billy Mitchell's teachings forward and made a great impact on the conduct of air warfare in World War II. In September 1918, Mitchell commanded the first mass use of aircraft for bombing attacks on enemy supply routes and for supporting the ground troops. This attack involved nearly 1,500 Allied airplanes and was important in deciding the outcome of the war. However, it was not until after the war that Mitchell was able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the air weapon against naval vessels. Although Mitchell was forced to sacrifice his military career for his beliefs, he unquestionably had a large influence on aviation's golden age. Because World War I was fought in Europe, the American public was isolated from actual battlefield. Except for the American troops serving in Europe, Americans were unaware of the increasing importance of air power in World War I. Therefore, when the war ended, the United States was the only nation involved in the war that had not learned the most important lesson taught by World War I. If you control the air, you cannot be beaten. If you lose the air, you cannot win.